Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old, an anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everybody. A couple of weeks ago, we did a show on U Thant, the great United Nations Secretary General in the 1960s, the glory years of the United Nations, if indeed the United Nations did have a glory period. The book Peacemakers, written by his nephew, Thant Myint, and we had an interesting conversation about this remarkable man who went from being a provincial school teacher in Burma, now called, of course, Myanmar, to becoming the third Secretary General of the United Nations, which he ran between 1961 and 1971. Since then, the United Nations has been in decline on lots of fronts. Some people celebrate this, some people mourn it. There was an interesting cover story in Tablet magazine on the end of the UN by my guest, Seth Barron from New York City. Seth, should we be mourning or celebrating the end of the United Nations, if indeed what the title of your essay in Tablet suggests that is the future or the lack of the future of the United Nations?
Thanks, Andrew. I would say from a certain perspective, the end of the UN has already happened. Sure, it's still there. There's a large building on the East River, and there's a lot of people who come to it and, attend meetings and so forth. But I think in a real sense, at least in the United States and probably other places, the UN has lost a lot of its significance. I would say, 40 years ago and more, the position of the UN Secretary General was really important. And I think everybody knew who he was. I'd say that's kind of ended. I don't think most people would know who the current UN Secretary General is. And I don't think most people really look to the UN as, a body of world governance, as having a lot of moral stature, as being particularly relevant. I sort of feel like it has ended. Now, look, how you feel about that, I guess, will say a lot about how you feel about global politics. I personally think the UN has outlived a lot of its usefulness, at least for the United States.
What do you mean global politics? I mean, I don't think anyone would disagree with you in terms of the state of the United Nations. The Economist magazine, one of the more internationalist weeklies out there, had a piece recently on the United Nations at 80, the UN's grim future. Why would one's view of the United Nations be dependent on one's politics, in your view?
Well, listen, let's just look at what the UN has accomplished vis-a-vis its purpose. When the UN was established 85 years ago, or 80 years ago rather, the point of it was to prevent war and to maintain peace. This was the vision following World War II, this tremendous catastrophe following World War I and World War II. I mean, probably 120 million people were killed, empires collapsed. It was a total disaster. And there was a vision that, okay, this can never be allowed to happen again. So if we have this international world government, then we can prevent it. I would say that that's been a complete failure. I mean, forget
A
about the fact
complete
that
failure or not a failure?
it has been a failure.
Well, but let me just jump in here. I mean, we
Sure.
don't have Mint Yu on the show, but he would argue, or he argued on the show, that his uncle, U Thant, helped in terms of making sure, for example, that the Cuban Missile Crisis didn't develop into a full-scale nuclear war, which might have destroyed the planet. Was also influential in various Middle Eastern pieces in the 1960s. So, I mean, surely the UN had some influence, or would you dismiss that?
No. I mean, I would say the UN did have influence, and particularly in the period when U Thant was the Secretary General. He started before decolonization really got going, and ended when it was, pretty much a done deal. But I'm thinking later on. Okay, Somalia in 1993, Rwanda in 1994, Bosnia in 1995. Okay, in each of these cases, a UN peacekeeping force was on the ground, and then horrible massacres ensued.
And in Bosnia, of course, Srebrenica is a particularly gruesome and tragic example of that.
Oh, absolutely. And the UN soldiers just did nothing or less than nothing. And I think if you look around the world now, I'm not talking about, in the 60s. Now, things have got, I mean, what have the UN stopped? We've got Sudan, Ukraine, Syria, Libya, Gaza, Myanmar. The United Nations has had no meaningful response to any of this.
Your essay suggests that, in a way, perhaps the United States might retire or retreat from the United Nations. But isn't this a cause and effect problem, that one of the reasons, maybe not the only reason, but one of the reasons why the UN is so powerless these days is because of the US's indifference or ambivalence towards the organization?
I think that depends. I would say, yes, perhaps under Trump, there's a lot of skepticism about the UN, but certainly under Obama and under Biden, the U.S. foreign policy was very much aligned with the multilateral vision of global governance that the UN represents. Yes, it's true that the U.S. vetoes a lot of Security Council resolutions, but the U.S. pays 22% of the bill to keep the UN going, and is hosts it, and is certainly involved in a lot of things. I don't know if that's really exactly the problem, that the U.S. has ruined it.
I didn't know. That wasn't my point. I'm simply suggesting that a U.S. retreat would mark. I mean, you've suggested that it's already dead anyway. But if the U.S. was to retreat, God knows what would happen to its offices in New York. But it would mark the end of the United Nations.
Well, that's a good question. I think on some level the United Nations would stick it out. In my piece, I note that the Rome collapsed in 476, right? But the Roman Senate kept meeting for another 200 years. They would meet. They would probably discuss wars they could conduct. They probably talked about various public works they would like to construct. They didn't have any money. They didn't have any power. Rome was sacked, but the Senate was still going. Institutions can carry on for a long time. Once they replace whatever their original mission was, once they replace that with just continuity of the institution, they can keep going. I would say that even if the U.S. pulled out, even if the UN relocated to Geneva or Doha or wherever they chose, Ottawa, I think it would still it could still keep going. I mean, there's all kinds of international organizations that aren't massively powerful or significant that don't involve the United States.
You noted that the United Nations came out of the ruins of the Second World War and the failure of the League of Nations, the promise of some sort of international body that could enable peace or encourage peace was its foundations. Of course, Eleanor Roosevelt was very much involved in its foundations. It was formed in San Francisco. Does the history, in your view, of the United Nations since then, does it suggest that there is some sort of structural problem with the idea of international governance? Or does it suggest that we did it the wrong way?
That's an interesting question. Look, the problem with international governance, I mean, here's the thing. I mean, law and governance only works when there's sovereignty. So nations are sovereigns, and they can control what happens within their borders. But unless you're really going to just give up national sovereignty and have some kind of republic of the world, there's going to be problems. I mean, what is international law exists only insofar as people respect the idea of it, because there's no way to enforce international law. Essentially, police actions taken by the United Nations, for instance, when North Korea invaded South Korea and the UN voted the Security Council voted to, join in to defend South Korea. I mean, at that moment, the Soviet Union had absented itself from the Security Council. It was kind of boycotting it. So for about 6 months or so, in the absence of the Soviet Union, the UN voted to do this. If the Soviet Union had been there, that probably wouldn't have happened. My point is it takes the consent of the members for the institution to have power, and essentially, the powerful countries are not going to go along with the UN's claim to be like super sovereign. Does that make sense?
But isn't there Seth, a Hobbesian quality here, or there should be a Hobbesian quality? You know that not all the great powers want to go along with it, but don't they recognize, or shouldn't they recognize, that it's in their power? Sometimes, as Hobbes argued in Leviathan, we don't always want to do what the ruler wants, but it's better than a war of all against all.
Sure. But that's why countries have bilateral arrangements frequently, or locally have multilateral arrangements. So, Trump, for instance, he doesn't really like multilateralism. He prefers bilateralism, making deals one-on-one. That way, he feels the United States can preserve its leverage as opposed to, dissipate it. Look, I guess so. But at the same time, most nations are democratic to one extent or another, and have to answer to their populace. I mean, we don't have very many absolute sovereigns like Leviathan, and so
Hobbes wasn't arguing really for an absolute sovereign. He was simply arguing that we need laws that sometimes contradict our own interests if we're to maintain peace.
Maybe this is above my pay grade to get into all the political philosophy of it. I see your point. It's just practically speaking. I mean, I guess maybe Machiavelli is a better person to look to. I quote in my piece a former diplomat named and lawyer named James Lindsay, who said that essentially international law is a fiction, even more than just regular law being a fiction, because it's essentially just used as a cudgel by the powerful countries to force to throw their weight around. I mean, if you look at the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court, typically the people they bring before them are, they go after African leaders in countries that aren't very powerful and will, like for instance, Duterte was recently arrested in the Philippines and delivered to The Hague. Okay, well, I guess you could argue that he deserves it, but at the same time, it's just because he fell out of favor with the current ruler in the Philippines. So then international law becomes a way to punish your political opponents. Like,
so you're really saying then, Seth, or at least in your view, there's no such thing as or there can't be any such thing as international law and justice. It just reflects the interests of the powerful.
I think so. Yeah, I think so. I think you can have look, unless you have a police force to enforce the law, then what is law? So that's why the UN doesn't really strike me as ultimately that's serious.
But isn't that excusing the vulgarity here, a chicken and egg situation? Is the only way to get a stronger UN, the only way to get a UN police force is to have a UN police force? I mean, I take your point on some of the failures of UN missions overseas in wars, but there are always hiccups, at least at first. I mean, wasn't there any promise in UN security services and forces and peace negotiators? You're dismissing everything that's happened?
Well, like, look at at what happened in Haiti, and I talk about this in my piece. The UN sends contingents from different member countries to attend to their peacekeeping, the UN's peacekeeping forces and their obligations. Okay, so Sri Lanka was detailed to send a contingent to Haiti to help keep the peace. The Sri Lankan they built a brothel, and they set about raping and exploiting Haitian children to such a grotesque and massive extent. I mean, it's a wonder that it isn't more like, in the news, except it's just so ugly and embarrassing. Like, researchers found out later that Haitian children knew all the Sinhalese slang terms for sex acts and body parts. Okay, so this sounds pretty bad, but the UN has no authority over these detachments. They retain, Sri Lanka retains all of the disciplinary power and authority over its own.
So that's not really, isn't that a problem with the structure of the UN rather than the idea of the UN?
Okay, but I mean, look, if you're talking about 200 nations, ranging in size from, I don't know, Vanuatu or Belize or Guyana, which have 500,000 people, and then they have equal say in they have an equal vote to India or China with over 1 billion people. It seems like there's a little discordance there. It's kind of like, yes, the ideals of the UN are great, and I talk about this in my piece. Like, you visit the UN and it's glorious. It reminds you of like Epcot Center or a World's Fair. It just bursts with all of this like 1950s style enthusiasm for technology and the space age and the unity of man. Yes, the ideals are fine. I just think that when you get down to the nitty gritty, then you have, the Sri Lankan contingent, doing depraved stuff all over Haiti. There's just invariably going to be exploitation.
You're always saying, I take your point. I mean, certainly no one's going to defend what happened in Haiti, and these accusations have been pretty much proved, as you note in your piece. But shouldn't we be recognizing the problems rather than almost sort of silently celebrating it, saying, well, this thing can't work?
I'm hardly celebrating the mass rape of Haitian children.
I don't mean that. I'm not suggesting anyone celebrate.
No. I see your point. Fine. Let them try to work it all out. But it's kind of like using your brain to fix your brain. There's no higher authority to come in.
But that's what we do, Seth. When we have a problem with our brain, we go to a brain doctor.
Right, we go to a brain doctor. But who is the brain doctor who's going to fix the UN?
Well, the United Nations, or at least the United States. There was an interesting piece recently in the New York Times. I'm sure you saw it. In it, The headline was, "Autocrats move quickly to fill void as Trump retreats from the UN." I don't want to turn this into another boring conversation about Trump. But isn't that ultimately the consequence, that if Trump does indeed retreat from the United Nations, I was going to say the United States, that would be a Freudian slip.
Right.
Then it opens up the void, as you said. The United Nations isn't going away. So it enables perhaps the Chinese or the Russians or the Iranians or other authoritarian states to become more powerful internationally, because these countries aren't going away and the world isn't going away.
Well, look, we've seen the decline of the United States relative to the rest of the world for years. Look, when the United Nations was founded, basically by the United States, the United States after World War II was more powerful than any other country in the history of the world. We had 50% of the world's wealth, 50% of the world's productive capacity. We controlled both sides of both oceans. That's just astounding if you think about it. And then, of course, I'd say the United States, sure, it had its moments of brutality over the last 80 years and overstepping and so forth, but it did spread the wealth. The United States didn't have to give China all of its, productive capacity. So other countries have risen, and the United States has, relatively fallen, even though it still remains extremely powerful. Sure, yes, the United States had, but the U.S. I guess what Trump would say is, okay, yes, we are in the context of the United Nations. Yes, the U.S. has retreated some, but in other arenas, you could argue the United States is stronger than it was.
But Seth, as you know, the United Nations was in many ways a creation of the United States. And because of the United States' own sense of itself, it's always, or many internationalists, at least in the US tradition, have seen America as a kind of mini United Nations. So the strength of the United Nations and the strength of the United States kind of go together. Aren't they mirrors of one another?
Well, I think, yes, at a certain point that was true. You notice that skepticism about the United Nations in the United States really started after decolonization, when, it became no longer a club of the United States and its allies, and then the Soviet Union and its allies. But, membership expanded radically, and you had all of these former colonies, new nations, joining the UN. And so it became much more third world focused. It became much more like a place for the global south to position itself and, express itself. So I would say that, yes, the UN stopped being a reflection of U.S. power, maybe in the 60s or 70s. I mean, in 1974, when Yasser Arafat stood on the rostrum at the UN General Assembly with a holster, ranting about Zionism and Israel. I mean, I would say at that point, it would be hard for the United States to, it would be hard for someone to argue that the United States was necessarily the dominant, figure in the vision of the UN.
Although, I mean, Israel and Arafat are marginal issues for the United States. It's a small country in the Middle East, whereas the United States is a large country. So I'm not sure how those two things are connected. I mean, Israel isn't part of the United States, is it?
No, of course not. But just the idea of Arafat, Arafat as the, look, at the time, Arafat was essentially, running a terrorist group that was constantly, that had just 2 years before perpetrated the Munich massacre, was blowing up planes. So, the fact that the leader of this group, I'm not saying that Israel is necessarily the focus, but the fact that this guy was there sort of indicates that, maybe the UN wasn't so much like a mirror of the United States at that point. I would say, though, that though Israel is a very small country, it takes up a lot of attention at the UN. For instance, this is interesting to note. Since 2015, the United Nations has passed 173 resolutions condemning Israel. It's passed 27 against Russia, 12 against Syria, 11 against the US, 10 against North Korea, and 9 each against Myanmar and Iran. And that's it. During that same period, the World Health Organization has issued 17 condemnatory resolutions, all of them against Israel. So, and none against any other country. So
what does that say in your view? I mean, I think probably people can probably already guess what your politics is on Israel. They only have to go to your X page to say that. What is it about Israel that, and the situation in Israel, Gaza, Palestine? What is it about that in your view brings out the worst about the UN?
Well, that's a funny question.
Not that funny, is it?
Well, it's an interesting question. I would say that there's an extent to which all of these countries use Israel as a kind of whipping boy for the faults of themselves and their own human rights violations. It's a wonderful way to deflect. They can just point to Israel as the cause, as the root of all suffering.
But why couldn't they point to other countries? They could point to Syria or Sudan or South Africa.
Great question. I mean, are they...
Well, right. So what's the reason?
Well, you could argue that it's anti-Semitic. I know that phrase has become very cautionary these days, and you're not really, people tut if you say it. Clearly, it's anti-Zionist, and there is a sense in which the third worldism, you might even call it, there's a certain type of well, let's just say the global Southism, the third worldism. There's this vision that colonialism has been a disaster for humanity, and Israel is really the last instance of the colonial 19th century settler colonial perspective, and it's still going on, and it needs to be ended because it just represents everything bad in history. So, that's the anti-Zionist perspective. And I think that since decolonization, that has been the fighting colonization.
It seems, though, a particular tragedy that a conflict as minor as the one in Israel should become, at least in the way you're presenting it, the real reason why the UN might be ending. I mean, you've written this piece called The End of the UN. Whatever one thinks about Israel and Palestine, surely it's not that important. I mean, who really cares?
Well, I mean, you've seen the news. People seem to be very up in arms about it.
Well, on both sides. I mean, some people might. Sure. I mean, Tablet has I don't know if you call it a Jewish magazine, but it certainly has a Jewish focus. I mean, sometimes when you see these sorts of pieces, there's almost I'm not suggesting you're celebrating the end of the UN, but you're certainly not mourning it.
No, not really. No. I mean, look, I'm not in Israel. I've never been to Israel. I just think that there's a certain clear bias against Israel that infects the UN, and they're clearly completely opposed to essentially they're opposed to the existence of the state. So that seems a little absurd.
It was interesting. I was reading. Sorry, go on.
No, go ahead.
So I was rereading Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem, which was a very controversial book written in 1963. She basically makes the argument that and it was a very controversial book because some people thought that she was certainly not defending Eichmann, but maybe there was controversy about the moralization of his crimes. And in the book, I think it's a very good book. And actually, I think it reads particularly well these days. But in the book, she argues that her teacher in Germany, Karl Jaspers, was one of the critics of the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem because he suggested that the only way to try a mass murderer like Eichmann in this terrible crime, this unimaginable crime, was in an international court. And when I was reading that and thinking about it, I wonder what that says about the United Nations. I mean, I know the United Nations is not the only international body, but shouldn't we want more, especially in an age where maybe not so much the crimes of the Nazis, but there are more and more terrible crimes against humanity, that we need these kinds of international organizations, that we shouldn't be, if not celebrating them, just simply saying, well, Machiavelli was right and the nations act in their own interest and they can never really work together.
You have a point. But, I know a diplomat who was the U.S. ambassador to an African nation, a Southern African nation, and then worked in Angola. And his comment about Rwanda was like, well, if we were going to really have trials, like war crimes trials in Rwanda, you'd basically have to try everybody in the nation because it was such a mass thing. I agree with you. Look, you don't want people to be warlords. You don't want people to perpetrate genocides or mass slaughters.
Well, that kind of goes without saying, doesn't it?
Right. Yes. I don't really know that. Look, I mean, there's plenty of people who say that the United States is like the biggest war criminal in the world. Vietnam, we essentially, killed millions of people. Look, the Iraq war, even before 9/11. I mean, this is kind of faded. But the United States sanctions regime against Saddam Hussein's Iraq under Clinton killed 500,000 children just through starvation, disease, stuff like that. And, asked point blank about it, Madeleine Albright said, yes, we think it's worth it. We think the cost is worth it. If you want to get down to it, Noam Chomsky says, well, by the standards of Nuremberg, every president since Truman should be hanged. Now, he's not really saying that obviously that's not going to happen.
Do you agree with him?
Well, if you're going to apply the standards of Nuremberg, maybe.
Yeah, I'm not. Anyway, that's another subject. Finally, it's taking these arguments to their absurd.
Okay.
I'm not sure why one would hang Eisenhower. Maybe Truman for different reasons. But anyway, let's end on internationalism. If you go to the UN site, the website, there's all these promises of the sustainability, all these initiatives, not just on gender, but on air pollution. There is a genuine environmental crisis. Again, it's been politicized, lots of debates about how imminent it is and how existential it is. But isn't something like global warming an example of something that only an international body like the UN can address, because it escapes borders? It's not like massacres in Rwanda or Gaza or Ukraine.
Yeah. Sure. I guess so. But look at the Paris Accords. The Paris Climate Accords promised to, reduce carbon emissions worldwide. It was really ballyhooed. It was this tremendous success, according to, the Obama administration and the UN. But if you look at what it was there was no enforcement mechanism. Every nation essentially just said, well, here's our goals. And then crucially, China and India were exempted from having to promise to reduce their carbon emissions for 10 years, at which point they could use whatever they were emitting at that point as their baseline. Now, those countries emit so much carbon, like so much pollution, so much more than any other country, that it's almost like absurd to pretend like this meant anything. Now, yes, it's fine. Look, plastic, there's a massive plastic island in the Pacific. This is all from Southeast Asian countries that just dump all of their garbage into the ocean, into rivers in the ocean. But in New York City, they've banned plastic straws because they don't want the straws to wind up choking fish. Now, no straws from the United States wind up in the ocean, except maybe a handful. So I'm just saying that there's all kinds of. Look,
yeah, I don't know enough on.
It sounds great.
Or like the plastics crisis in the South Pacific to call you on it, but a lot of this sounds like sort of anti-UN talking points. Finally, the UN is trying, or claims to at least be trying, to reform itself. Have you just, Seth, do you just give up? Is this something that you think is hopeless, that we just return to national power and that at some point maybe there'll be either a nuclear war or an invasion from some alien species that might force us to work with one another, but until then, there's no hope for any kind of international government?
Well, look, you've got the EU, right? Would you say that's very successful?
Well, it depends who you ask, but I think if you ask Germans, French people, Italians, certainly many people in Eastern Europe, they would some of them at least would respond enthusiastically. And in the context of the catastrophe of the Second World War and the First World War, it's certainly been successful. There haven't been any wars between France and Germany.
That's for sure.
In the last 100 years. Well, not in the last 70 years, right?
So 80 years, yeah. Okay, I'm just, I mean, I'm not saying that you can't have multipolar treaties and organizations that keep peace. I just don't know that the UN is necessary. I mean, I think maybe world government is too big.
Well, you call it whatever you call it. Do you think the UN could be reformed? It could be reinvented. It could be renamed. Do you just want to give up on it?
I don't want to give up on anything. Sure, if you could reform the UN, maybe it would be better. I'm not saying that the ideals of the UN are necessarily corrupt. It doesn't seem to be. I mean, I think it's I think the popular image of the UN is that it's essentially like a nest of corruption.
Is that true in your view?
I think there's probably a lot of that.
So we shouldn't really mourn it. Yeah, the UN is finished, but it was a nest of corruption.
Maybe you're more of an internationalist.
Sorry?
Maybe you're more of an internationalist.
I think I'm certainly more of an internationalist than you, which isn't saying much. Anyway, that was a very interesting, a depressing conversation, but maybe he's right. Maybe Seth Barron is right to argue that the UN is finished and that we shouldn't really mourn it, that it could never really work, that nations behave in their own interests. I don't know. Maybe you make a fair point. It's hard to, to go back to the world of the 30s, Seth, is also a little chilling, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Which is what we seem to be doing in Ukraine and Gaza and maybe even in Taiwan.
Yeah. Look, it doesn't look great. And some people would probably say, well, maybe it's all a fault of the US because the US has been throwing its weight around. But if the US were to say recede from the world scene and China were to take over, does anybody really think that China wouldn't rule the world in its own self-interest? Is there really going to be a powerful country that says, yes, we're just going to submit to the will of 40 or 70 countries that have a couple million people and very little GDP, and we'll just allow them to tell us what to do? That just seems very unlikely.
Well, on that depressing note, Seth Barron's The End of the UN piece. I'm not sure if it's funny. I mean, it's ironically funny. It's sadly funny, but maybe you're right, Seth.
I've got all kinds of jokes in that piece.
So let's end on the best joke. What's the best joke in The End of the UN piece?
God. Geez, that's a really good question. Well, I think when I said that Zohran Mamdani, who's going to be the next mayor of New York, this Ugandan, Indian, socialist, Muslim, but that he comes from this very, very sophisticated cosmopolitan family. He adores Frantz Fanon and all that stuff. When I say that if the KGB tried to run him up in a lab, they couldn't have done any better than what they got. I thought that was funny.
What's that got to do with the UN?
Nothing. Well, I'm just because I'm saying that here's somebody who really believes wholeheartedly in international law. You asked me for the best.
Saying that Mamdani is running for mayor of New York is the equivalent of what, a mass murderer or KGB officer?
No, I didn't say that. I just said because he's so he has so much, because he said that he wants to arrest Netanyahu. Okay, now.
Yeah, and he says if he's elected New York mayor, which I'm sure Netanyahu. I don't think he has any right to elect. I mean, if Netanyahu showed up at the UN, I don't think he could arrest him.
No, he couldn't, of course. And the United States isn't a party to the International Criminal Court. So, which neither is China, India, Pakistan, Indonesia. Like, none of the large countries are Russia are parties to the International Criminal Court, I should add. But my point is and when asked about this, Mamdani said, he said, well, I believe that New York City should be brought back into compliance with international law. So he's essentially, this is like a perfect example. His belief, he believes that international law is a set of principles that are above, superior to the law of New York City, New York State, and the United States. That there's an ideal law that, essentially written down by academics like his father, who's a post-colonial scholar, and, various judges, that's the real law, not the law that he would be elected to and sworn to follow and execute, not law as, formulated by elected legislatures and executed by elected mayors, governors, presidents, but this other law, this higher law. So essentially, it's lawless. And so when
we got to end here. Seth, but you don't seem to believe in any kind of higher moral law. I ask you questions about
as far as states go.
You don't believe that there's such a thing as. Do you even believe in the idea of human rights?
Of course, I do.
Isn't that a higher human law? Isn't that a higher moral law?
But how are states? How are you? Sure, but how are you going to force states to enforce it?
Well, that's the dilemma. That's what we did or should have perhaps the United Nations for. Seth Barron has announced the end of the UN, for better or worse. I hope he's wrong, but we shall see. A wonderful conversation, Seth. And I'm going to go and have a Chinese dinner now to underline my internationalism. I hope you're going to have some Indian food tonight, right?
Sure. Perhaps.